The night exploded with metal twisting against metal headlights, flaring like dying stars and screams cutting through the smoke. A woman's voice cracked in terror, trapped inside the mangled wreck of her Mercedes. Tires hissed, flames threatened, and bystanders froze in shock. But one man didn't. Matthew Hayes yanked his old pickup truck to the shoulder of the Chicago Expressway, the sudden stop jolting his 10-year-old son Nathan forward against his seatbelt. The boy's eyes widened at the overturned luxury car, its silver body crumpled, like discarded aluminum foil flames already licking at its undercarriage. "Stay in the truck, Nathan. Lock the doors. Don't move." "But Dad, do as I say, son, now." The firmness in Matthew's voice brooked no argument. Nathan nodded, his small face a mask of fear as his father sprinted toward the wreckage. Matthew felt the heat before he reached the car, saw the gasoline pooling beneath it, rainbow slick and dangerous. The woman inside was barely visible through the smoke-filled interior. Long, dark hair matted with something darker. Still her designer blazer torn and bloody. Bystanders stood filming with their phones, their faces ghoulish in the orange glow of the flames. Matthew shoved past them, his work boots crunching on shattered glass. The driver's side door had been crushed inward, the metal twisted beyond recognition. He wrapped his calloused hands around the window frame and pulled, muscles straining beneath his worn flannel shirt. The metal groaned, refusing to yield. Behind him, the crowd gasped as flames leapt higher from the engine block. Heat scorched Matthew's face, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. The woman inside moaned, her eyes fluttering open for a moment, green eyes wide with terror. "Please," her voice barely a whisper. Something primal took over then. Matthew braced one boot against the car's frame and pulled again, tendons standing out on his neck, a war building in his chest. The door shrieked, then gave way, tearing free with such sudden force that Matthew stumbled backward. Blood welled from fresh cuts on his hands, but he didn't feel it. He dove into the smoke-filled interior, hands finding the woman's seatbelt, fumbling with the buckle. From his truck, Nathan watched in horror, small palms pressed against the window. His father disappeared into the wreckage as flames climbed higher. The boy's breath fogged the glass, prayers falling from his lips like his mother had taught him. Before she left, prayers he'd stopped believing in until this moment. Inside the car, Matthew worked by feel more than sight. The smoke burned his lungs, the heat seared his skin, but his hands remained steady. The seatbelt finally gave way, and he gathered the semi-conscious woman into his arms. Her head lolled against his chest, blood from her forehead staining his already grimy shirt. Something hard pressed against his ribs, a diamond ring on her finger, the stone catching the firelight. Around her neck, a platinum chain with a pendant shaped like an elegant S. "Gotta get you out now. The car's gonna blow." Matthew backed out of the wreckage, the woman clutched against his chest. Her expensive perfume mingled with the smell of gasoline and burning plastic. He was 10 steps away when the first explosion hit, the concussive force driving him to his knees. Shielding the woman with his body, Matthew felt heat sear his back as the car's gas tank ignited, sending a fireball into the night sky. The crowd scattered, screaming. Only when he was certain the danger had passed did Matthew lower the woman gently to the ground. She was young, early 30s perhaps, with the kind of beauty that spoke of privilege and care. Despite the blood and soot, her features held a quiet dignity that reminded Matthew of carved marble. He stripped off his jacket, folding it beneath her head as a pillow, then checked her pulse, rapid but strong. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Matthew glanced back at his truck, where Nathan's pale face watched through the window. The boy gave a small, tight wave, relief, visible even from a distance. Matthew turned back to the injured woman, whose eyes had opened again, struggling to focus. "Who?" Her voice a cracked whisper. "Help's coming. Try not to move. You pulled me out." Her fingers weakly clutched at his sleeve, leaving bloody prints on the worn fabric. Matthew nodded, suddenly self-conscious of his oil-stained hands in 3-day stubble against her manicured perfection. The woman's eyes drifted closed again as ambulances and fire trucks screamed onto the scene, bathing the expressway in pulsing red and blue. EMTs swarmed around them, gently pushing Matthew aside. One of them, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and iron-gray hair, paused to look at his bleeding hands. "You saved her life tonight. Not many would have gone near that car. Just did what anyone would do." The EMT's eyebrows lifted. "No, honey, they wouldn't, and we both know it." Matthew retreated to his truck, where Nathan launched himself across the seat, wrapping small arms around his father's neck. The boy was shaking, tears dampening Matthew's shirt collar. Matthew held his son close, breathing in the familiar scent of drugstore shampoo and the chocolate milk the boy had with dinner. I thought you were gonna die like Mommy's boyfriend did. Matthew pulled back, looking into his son's tear-streaked face. I'm right here, buddy. Not going anywhere. Promise. Nathan wiped his nose on his sleeve. You're a hero, Dad, like Captain America. Matthew shook his head, watching as they loaded the woman into an ambulance. I'm just a guy who did what needed doing. No more, no less. The police took his statement, their eyes traveling from his patched jeans to his battered truck with the mismatched front fender. One officer asked twice if he knew the woman, disbelief coloring his tone. Another slipped him a business card muttering something about calling if the lady's family wanted to express gratitude. Matthew pocketed the card without looking at it. An hour later, they were back on the road heading toward their rented house in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's outskirts. Nathan had fallen asleep, his head lolling against the passenger window. Matthew's hands stung where glass had cut them, and his back felt tight where the explosion had singed his shirt. Tomorrow would bring fresh pain. He knew the aftermath of adrenaline was never kind. The dashboard clock read 11:42 p.m. Matthew had to be at Harper's garage by 7, which meant waking at 5:30 to get Nathan to his before-school program. Another day of crawling under cars, troubleshooting engines that other mechanics had given up on. Another day of making enough to keep the lights on and food in the refrigerator, but never quite enough to get ahead. The mailbox was stuffed when they finally pulled into the driveway of their small rental. Matthew carried Nathan inside first, tucking the boy into bed without waking him. Only then did he return for the mail, sorting through it at the kitchen table. Bill credit card offer, and his stomach clenched a notice from the property management company. He tore it open, though he already knew what it would say. The monthly rent was increasing by 30% effective in 30 days. An amount he simply couldn't afford, not with what Harper's paid him, not with Nathan's asthma medication costing what it did. Matthew sat in the darkened kitchen, the single overhead bulb casting harsh shadows across his face. The walls were thin enough that he could hear the neighbor's television through them, some late-night talk show host making jokes about politicians. On the refrigerator, Nathan's school artwork was held up by magnets from local pizza places. A child's drawing of 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, standing beside what was supposed to be their truck, me and Dad, scrawled in wobbly letters beneath. 5 years alone with his boy. 5 years since Marie had walked out unable to handle the transition from military wife to civilian spouse of a struggling veteran. 5 years of doing everything himself, school lunches, parent-teacher, conferences, nightmare, comfort. Flu nursing. 5 years of drowning in the debts Marie had left behind from her secret gambling habit. 5 years of putting one foot in front of the other day after day because Nathan needed him to. And now they might lose their home. Again. Matthew rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the stubble rasp against his palm. He needed a shower, needed to clean the cuts on his hands, needed sleep. Tomorrow's problems would have to wait for tomorrow. He'd faced worse odds before. Somehow they'd make it through this too. The morning news blared from the small television in Harper's waiting area. Matthew had been at work for 2 hours already, elbow deep in the transmission of a 2010 Chevy Malibu, when Frank Harper called him into the office. Frank was 60 with a paunch that spoke of too many beers and not enough exercise, but his eyes were sharp and knowing. There's something you should see, Matt. The waiting area was empty of customers, but the TV had drawn a small crowd of mechanics. Matthew wiped his hands on a shop rag, leaving black streaks across the already stained cloth. On the screen, cell phone footage showed the burning car from the night before. And there he was, tearing the door open, disappearing into the smoke, emerging with the woman in his arms. The explosion that followed looked even more dramatic on camera than it had felt in person. Local man performs heroic rescue, the caption read. Below it, his name, Matthew Hayes, 37 of Chicago. Hell, Matt. Frank's voice held genuine awe. You didn't tell me you went full superhero last night. Matthew shook his head, already turning back toward the garage. It's not a big deal. The car was on fire. She needed help. End of story. But the news anchor was still talking. The woman rescued has been identified as Alexandra Sullivan, daughter of billionaire hotel and real estate magnate Richard Sullivan. She remains hospitalized in stable condition. Matthew froze, the shop rag twisted between his hands. Sullivan. The name meant something even to him. Sullivan hotels were among the most prestigious in the world, their distinctive S logo, a symbol of luxury. The pendant around the woman's neck suddenly made sense. You saved a billionaire's daughter, Matt. Frank's grin was wide beneath his salt and pepper mustache. Bet there's a reward coming. I don't want a reward. Matthew's voice was sharper than he intended. I just want to finish the Malibu's transmission so Mrs. Petrovich can get to her dialysis appointment tomorrow. The other mechanics drifted back to their stations, some casting curious glances his way. Only Frank lingered, his expression softening. Listen, son, I know things are tight for you and the boy. If Sullivan's people come around offering a thank you, there's no shame in accepting it. Matthew turned away back toward the familiar territory of engines and transmissions, of problems that made sense and could be fixed with the right tools and enough patience. I don't need charity, Frank, especially not from people like that. The phone started ringing within the hour. News vans parked outside Harper's by noon. Matthew refused all interviews, keeping his head down, focusing on his work. Frank fielded calls, turning away reporters with increasing irritation. By closing time, social media had turned Matthew into an overnight sensation. Highway hero was trending. Matthew picked up Nathan from after-school care, the boy bubbling with excitement. His classmates had seen his dad on the news. His teacher had called Matthew a everyday hero during morning circle. For the first time, kids who usually ignored Nathan had wanted to sit with him at lunch. "You're famous." Dad Nathan's eyes shone with a pride that made Matthew's chest ache. "Does this mean we're going to be rich now?" Matthew glanced at the eviction notice sitting on the kitchen counter as they entered the house. "No, buddy, that's not how it works. Besides, we don't need money to be happy, right?" Nathan's face fell slightly. "I guess. But maybe we could get a PlayStation, just a used one." Matthew ruffled his son's hair, pushing down the familiar guilt. "We'll see what Santa brings this year, okay? Now homework before dinner. I'm thinking spaghetti tonight." The next morning brought more reporters, more phone calls. Matthew grew increasingly irritated at the intrusion, the way it disrupted the garage's work. Customers either stayed away, not wanting to deal with the media circus, or came specifically to gawk at the hero mechanic. Neither was good for business. A week after the accident, Matthew was replacing brake pads on a Honda Civic when Frank appeared at his side, uncharacteristically fidgety. "There's someone here to see you, Matt, in the office." Matthew didn't look up from the caliper he was reinstalling. "Tell whatever reporter it is that I'm still not interested." "It's not a reporter." Frank's voice dropped to a near whisper. "It's her, the Sullivan woman." The wrench slipped in Matthew's hand, his knuckles banging against metal. He cursed under his breath, then wiped his hands on his coveralls. Behind Frank, he could see the other mechanics peering toward the office, curiosity written across their faces. The office was small, dominated by a desk cluttered with invoices and parts catalogs. Alexandra Sullivan stood by the window looking out at the garage floor. She'd turned at the sound of the door, and Matthew was struck by how different she appeared from the broken woman he'd pulled from the wreckage. Her dark hair was neatly styled, falling in soft waves to her shoulders. The gash on her forehead had been stitched, the bruising covered with expertly applied makeup. Only her left arm in a sling betrayed her recent trauma. "Mr. Hayes?" Her voice was warm but formal, with the polished accent of expensive education. "I've been looking forward to meeting you properly." Matthew was suddenly uncomfortably aware of the grease under his fingernails, the stains on his coveralls, the 3-day stubble he hadn't had time to shave. He'd never felt particularly self-conscious about being a mechanic before. Something about her presence, the tailored pantsuit that probably cost more than his monthly rent, the subtle gleam of diamonds at her ears, made him feel rough and unfinished. "Ms. Sullivan, I'm glad to see you're recovering well." She smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely beautiful to something more human and approachable. "Thanks to you. The doctors say if I'd been in that car even 2 minutes longer, I wouldn't be standing here. Just happened to be in the right place. Anyone would have done the same." Alexandra tilted her head, studying him. "That's not what the police report says, or the witnesses, or the burn unit doctor who treated your hands." Matthew glanced down at his hands, the cuts already healing, small burns forming new calluses atop the old. There had been no burn unit, just antiseptic and gauze from his bathroom cabinet after Nathan was asleep. "I'm not here to embarrass you, Mr. Hayes." Alexandra moved closer, reaching into an expensive leather handbag. "I'm here because I owe you my life, and while I know nothing can repay that, I'd like to trade." She withdrew an envelope, holding it out to him. Matthew didn't take it, his hands remaining stubbornly at his sides. Alexandra's expression flickered with surprise. "I don't mean to offend you." She hesitated, the envelope still extended between them. "But I understand from some research that you're a single father, that things might be financially challenging." Heat crawled up Matthew's neck, a flush of something between anger and humiliation. "Your research is mistaken. My son and I are doing just fine, ma'am. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have cars waiting." He turned toward the door, but her voice stopped him sharper now, with an edge of something that hadn't been there before. Why did you do it then? If not for recognition or reward, you risked your life for a complete stranger. Matthew faced her again, really looking at her for the first time. Behind the polished exterior, he glimpsed something unexpected, a genuine bewilderment, as if his refusal had disrupted some fundamental understanding of how the world worked. Because it was the right thing to do. Because I'd want someone to do the same if it were my son in that car. Because human life isn't a transaction, Ms. Sullivan. It's not something you put a price tag on afterward. Her green eyes widened slightly, the envelope lowering to her side. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, her composure slipping to reveal a vulnerability that the expensive clothes and makeup couldn't quite hide. I was running away. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as him. That night, I was supposed to be at my father's charity gala. There were photographers, investors, a man my father wanted me to meet. I couldn't breathe. I just left. Was driving too fast, took a curve wrong. Matthew wasn't sure why she was telling him this, what response she expected. He settled on honesty. We all run sometimes. It's what we do afterward that counts. Something shifted in her expression, then a recognition perhaps or a reassessment. She tucked the envelope back into her handbag with a small nod. I'd like to try again, Mr. Hayes, not with money. Perhaps. She glanced around the small office at the decades-old furniture and yellowing invoices. Perhaps I could bring lunch sometime, for you and the other mechanics, as a thank you. The request was so unexpected, so ordinary, that Matthew found himself nodding before he'd fully processed it. Sure, the guys would appreciate that. A real smile this time, not the polished one she'd worn earlier. Tomorrow then, around noon. After she'd gone, Frank cornered Matthew by the tool cabinet, his expression hovering between impressed and concerned. You turned down Sullivan money. Are you out of your mind? Matthew selected a socket wrench, focusing on the familiar weight of the tool, rather than meeting his boss's gaze. It wasn't about the money, Frank. I didn't save her for a reward. Frank ran a hand over his balding head, exasperation clear in the gesture. Maybe not, but that money could have changed things for you and Nathan. You've been killing yourself, working double shifts at the refinery on weekends. Your rent just went up. Your truck's held together with hope and duct tape. The truth of Frank's words stung more than Matthew wanted to admit. The rental increase notice sat on his kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. Nathan needed new shoes for school. The truck's transmission was making ominous sounds. But accepting money for saving a life felt wrong on a bone-deep level he couldn't fully articulate. I've got my reasons, Frank. Let's leave it at that. The next day, Alexandra arrived promptly at noon with enough gourmet sandwiches and pastries to feed the entire garage staff twice over. She'd dressed more casually, though what passed for casual in her world still looked expensive to Matthew's eye. In dark jeans and a simple blouse, her injured arm still in its sling. The mechanics were awkward at first, unused to having someone like Alexandra Sullivan in their space. But she sat on a stack of tires eating a sandwich and asking surprisingly knowledgeable questions about the cars they were working on, and gradually the atmosphere relaxed. Nathan arrived after school, his backpack slung over one narrow shoulder, stopping short at the sight of Alexandra. Matthew made the introductions, watching as his normally shy son became animated, showing Alexandra his science project photos on Matthew's battered phone. Alexandra listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made Nathan beam with pride. She came back the following day and the next. Each visit she brought something different. Pastries from a famous bakery, coffee from an expensive shop once, even a box of specialized tools that the garage had been making do without. Each gift carefully chosen to be useful rather than ostentatious, to be for everyone, rather than singling Matthew out. It was harder to refuse when she framed it that way. After the fourth visit, as Alexandra was leaving, Matthew walked her to her car, a much more modest sedan than the Mercedes that had been destroyed in the accident. Why do you keep coming back? He hadn't meant to ask so bluntly, but the question had been nagging at him. Alexandra considered him for a moment, her head tilted, in that now familiar way. Because you're the first person in years who's seen me as just a human being, not a Sullivan. It's refreshing. She climbed into her car before he could respond, leaving Matthew standing in the parking lot watching as she drove away. That evening, as Matthew helped Nathan with his math homework at their kitchen table, a knock came at the door. Matthew opened it to find a delivery man holding an enormous gift basket overflowing with food, premium steaks, gourmet pasta, fancy chocolates, and a hand-drawn card from Nathan's art set. No name, but Matthew knew exactly who had sent it. Nathan danced around the kitchen in excitement, eyes wide at the bounty. The stakes alone would have cost Matthew half a day's wages. His first instinct was to return it, but the joy on his son's face stopped him. Maybe this once he could accept the kindness without his pride getting in the way. 3 days later, Alexandra returned to the garage. This time she brought homemade cookies, slightly burnt around the edges, with a self-deprecating smile. First time baking. My housekeeper nearly had a heart attack when she found me in the kitchen at midnight. Matthew couldn't help but smile at the image of Alexandra Sullivan, heir to billions, fumbling with cookie dough in what was undoubtedly a kitchen larger than his entire house. The other mechanics teased her good-naturedly about the burnt edges, and she took it with grace, laughing at herself in a way that made something warm unfurl in Matthew's chest. As the weeks passed, Alexandra became a regular presence at Harper's garage. She would sit on an upturned crate watching Matthew work, asking questions about engines and transmissions. Sometimes she would help Nathan with homework while waiting, their heads bent together over textbooks. She never mentioned money again, never brought up the night of the accident. Instead, she told stories about growing up as the daughter of one of America's wealthiest men, the loneliness of boarding schools, the weight of expectations, the fishbowl existence of constant public scrutiny. Matthew found himself sharing two stories from his military service: the challenges of adjusting to civilian life, the joy and terror of raising Nathan alone. He told her about Marie's departure, how she'd left a note and emptied their bank account, disappearing with a man she'd met at a casino. How he'd discovered the gambling debts she'd hidden, the second mortgage she'd taken out on their house without his knowledge. What he didn't tell Alexandra was how close he'd come to falling apart after that. The drinking, the rage, the near loss of custody when he'd missed too many of Nathan's school events. The slow, painful climb back to stability. Some stories weren't meant for casual sharing, even with someone who was rapidly becoming a friend. As October gave way to November, the Chicago wind took on a bitter edge. Matthew pulled longer hours at the refinery on weekends, knowing the heating bills would soon increase. The rental company had sent a final notice: pay the increased rate or vacate by December 1st. He'd applied for apartments all over the city, but his credit was still damaged from Marie's debts, and the application fees alone were draining what little savings he had. One Tuesday afternoon, Matthew was beneath a Toyota 4Runner, replacing a rusted exhaust system when Frank's boots appeared beside the vehicle. "Matt, you need to come out. Now." Something in Frank's tone made Matthew slide out immediately, wiping his hands on a shop rag as he stood. Frank jerked his head toward the parking lot, his expression unreadable. Outside, a gleaming black Rolls-Royce idled, its windows tinted dark enough to obscure any passengers. As Matthew watched, the rear door open and a man stepped out. He was tall, with the kind of posture that spoke of power, accustomed to being respected. Silver hair swept back from a tanned face with sharp features. Though he had to be in his 60s, his body was trim and fit beneath an impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than Matthew earned in 3 months. Richard Sullivan, Alexandra's father. Sullivan surveyed the garage with the detached interest of a man evaluating a property for purchase rather than a place where people worked. His gaze finally settled on Matthew, taking in the grease-stained coveralls and worn work boots, with a slight narrowing of his eyes. "Mr. Hayes," Sullivan's voice was smooth-cultured, the voice of boardrooms and power lunches. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Matthew stepped forward, suddenly conscious of the other mechanics watching from the garage bay of Frank, hovering nervously nearby. Sullivan extended a manicured hand, and Matthew hesitated only briefly before shaking it, leaving a faint smudge of grease on the other man's palm. If Sullivan noticed, he gave no indication. "I wanted to thank you personally for saving my daughter's life." Sullivan's words were correct, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, a social nicety rather than genuine gratitude. "Alexandra is all I have left in this world. Her mother passed 2 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Sullivan. Your daughter is a remarkable woman." Sullivan's eyebrow rose slightly, as though surprised by the familiar way Matthew spoke of Alexandra. "Yes, she is, which makes her safety and happiness my highest priority." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Sullivan reached into his suit jacket and withdrew an envelope thicker than the one Alexandra had offered. "I understand you refused my daughter's gesture of gratitude. A man of principle, I respect that, Mr. Hayes. But principles won't keep a roof over your head or food on your son's table." Matthew stiffened, his hands clenching at his sides. "You've been investigating me." Sullivan smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. I make it my business to know who's involved with my daughter, especially someone with your colorful history. Heat crawled up Matthew's neck. Whatever Sullivan had discovered, the PTSD diagnosis, the drinking, the custody issues, was in the past. He'd worked hard to overcome those demons to be the father Nathan deserved. Sullivan continued, his voice dropping to ensure only Matthew could hear. A mechanic with a GED and an honorable discharge, raising a son alone in a rental house he can barely afford. Admirable in its way, but hardly the life Alexandra is accustomed to. He held out the envelope again, his gaze hard despite the smile that remained fixed on his face. This is more than gratitude, Mr. Hayes. It's recognition of reality. Men like you and men like me don't inhabit the same world. This will help you stay in yours where you belong. The insult was delivered with such casual confidence that it took Matthew's breath for a moment. Then anger surged hot and clarifying. He looked at the envelope, then back at Sullivan's face. Everyone has their price. Sullivan's smile widened, sensing victory. I'm just trying to find yours. Matthew stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gray in Sullivan's blue eyes. Close enough that the other man had to resist the urge to step back. There are things money can't buy, Mr. Sullivan. Self-respect is one of them. Keep your money. Sullivan's smile faded, his expression hardening into something colder, more dangerous. You're making a mistake, Hayes, one you can't afford. Matthew held his ground, meeting the billionaire's stare without flinching. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Sullivan tucked the envelope back into his suit jacket with a small shrug. Alexander has always had a soft spot for strays. It's a phase that will pass, as they always do. When it does, you'll regret not taking what was offered. He turned and walked back to the waiting Rolls-Royce, his posture rigid with controlled anger. Before getting in, he paused, looking back at Matthew with an expression of calculated assessment. You saved her once, Mr. Hayes, but understand this, I've been saving her every day of her life. From people exactly like you. The car door closed with a soft, expensive thunk. Matthew stood motionless as the Rolls-Royce glided out of the parking lot, its engine a soft purr of perfect mechanical engineering. Only when it had disappeared from view did he become aware of Frank and the others watching him, their expressions a mixture of awe and concern. What did Sullivan want? Frank's voice seemed to come from a distance. Matthew turned, heading back into the garage, back to the waiting Toyota with its rusted exhaust system. A problem he could solve, unlike the knot of anger and humiliation burning in his gut. To put me in my place. The next morning, Matthew dropped Nathan at school, then headed to Harper's as usual. The familiar routine should have been comforting oil changes, brake jobs, the diagnostic puzzle of a Subaru with a mysterious knocking engine. But Sullivan's words echoed in his mind, casting a shadow over the work he'd always taken pride in. At noon, Alexandra arrived as she had nearly every day for the past 3 weeks. She brought Cuban sandwiches from a place downtown, her smile bright as she greeted the mechanics. Matthew kept his distance, focusing on the Subaru's engine, responding with one-word answers when she spoke to him. Eventually, she cornered him by the parts cabinet, her green eyes concerned. Have I done something wrong? Matthew wiped his hands on a shop rag, not meeting her gaze. Your father came by yesterday. Her face fell, understanding immediately. I'm so sorry. Whatever he said, he made things perfectly clear. Matthew's voice came out harder than he intended. Whatever this is between us, it isn't real. It can't be. We come from different worlds, Alexandra. That's not true. Her injured arm was out of its sling now, and she reached for his hand. Matthew stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. Isn't it? Tell me, before the accident, would you have ever set foot in a place like this? Would you have noticed someone like me if I hadn't pulled you from that car? Alexandra flinched as if he'd struck her. That's not fair. I'm here because I want to be, not out of obligation or curiosity or whatever you're implying. Are you? Matthew pushed anger and hurt, making him reckless. Or am I just your latest rebellion against Daddy? The rough mechanic with dirty hands, I bet that really gets under his skin. The moment the words left his mouth, Matthew regretted them. Alexandra's face went blank, the openness he'd grown to appreciate shuddering behind a mask of dignified hurt. I thought you were different, that you saw me not just the Sullivan name and fortune. I guess we were both wrong. She left without another word, the Cuban sandwiches still in their takeout containers on Frank's desk. Matthew watched her go, telling himself it was for the best. A clean break now before Nathan got any more attached. Before he got any more attached. Frank found him later elbow deep in the Subaru's engine, working with the focused intensity of someone avoiding their thoughts. You want to tell me what that was about with the Sullivan girl? Matthew didn't look up from the spark plug he was replacing. Nothing to tell. Her father made it clear I should stay away. I'm just following instructions. Frank leaned against the car, arms folded across his chest. Since when do you follow anyone's instructions? Matt Military broke you of that habit pretty quick, as I recall. Matthew straightened, meeting his boss's knowing gaze. It's complicated, Frank. Usually is when a man starts caring about a woman he thinks is out of his league. It's not like that. She's grateful, that's all. Once the novelty wears off, she'll move on to the next charity case. Frank's eyebrows rose. That what you think you are to her? A charity case. The question hit too close to the fear lurking beneath Matthew's anger. He turned back to the engine, focusing on the familiar task to avoid answering. Frank sighed, pushing away from the car. Well, whatever it is or isn't, you'd better sort it out quick. You've got bigger problems. Matthew looked up sharply. What do you mean? Frank's expression was grim, his usual good humor nowhere to be found. Got a call from corporate this morning. They're cutting staff at all the locations. Last hired, first fired. The implication was clear. Matthew had been at Harper's for less than 2 years, one of the newer mechanics despite his experience. I'm sorry, Matt. Frank's voice was heavy with genuine regret. I fought for you, but the decision's above my pay grade. You've got until the end of the month. Matthew's hands tightened on the wrench he was holding, knuckles white with strain. Corporate decision. Just a coincidence it came the day after Sullivan's visit. Frank didn't answer, but his expression said everything Matthew needed to know. After a moment, the older man reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, holding it out with obvious reluctance. Your last paycheck plus 2 weeks severance. It's the best I could do. Matthew took the envelope, the paper thin between his fingers. Not enough for the increased rent. Not enough to secure a new apartment with his damaged credit. Not enough to keep Nathan in the stability he'd fought so hard to provide. I'll put the word out to some other shops. Frank's voice seemed to come from a distance. Someone's bound to need a mechanic with your skills. But Matthew knew better. Richard Sullivan's reach was long in Chicago business circles. If he wanted to make a point, closing one door wouldn't be enough. The drive to pick up Nathan from school was a blur. Matthew's thoughts circling like vultures. The severance pay, the rent increase, the dwindling savings account, the credit card already near its limit. Nathan needed new winter boots. His asthma medication was due for a refill. Christmas was coming, and the boy had his heart set on a PlayStation. Nathan climbed into the truck, immediately sensing something was wrong, despite Matthew's attempt at normalcy. The boy was perceptive, that way too used to reading his father's moods from the years when Matthew's PTSD had been at its worst. What's wrong, Dad? Did something happen at work? Matthew forced a smile, reaching over to ruffle his son's hair. Just a change of plans, buddy. I'm going to be looking for a new job. Harper's is making some cuts. Nathan's face fell, his small shoulders slumping beneath his too large backpack. Is it because of me? Because of my asthma medicine costing so much? The question pierced Matthew's heart. No, buddy, absolutely not. It's just business stuff. Nothing for you to worry about. Is Alexandra going to help us? Nathan's voice was small, hopeful. She likes us. I know she does. Matthew's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Alexandra has her own life, Nathan. She was just being nice because of what happened. Nathan looked unconvinced, his young face too serious for a 10-year-old. She doesn't act like she's just being nice. She acts like she's our friend. Matthew had no answer for that. Instead, he changed the subject, asking about Nathan's day at school, forcing enthusiasm he didn't feel. By the time they reached home, Nathan was chattering about his science project again, momentarily distracted from the adult problems weighing on his father. The mailbox held another notice from the rental company, this one with final warning stamped in red across the top. Matthew stuffed it into his pocket before Nathan could see it, pasting on a smile as they headed inside. That night, after Nathan was asleep, Matthew sat at the kitchen table with bills spread before him like a losing hand of cards. The math was unforgiving. Even if he found a new job, immediately the gap between income and expenses was widening beyond his ability to bridge it. They would have to move, but with his credit history and now unemployment, finding a new place would be nearly impossible. The homeless shelter was looking increasingly like their only option. A soft knock at the door startled him from his calculations. Matthew glanced at the clock, 10:45 p.m., far too late for casual visitors. He moved quietly to the door, not wanting to wake Nathan. Through the peephole, he saw Alexandra Sullivan, her expression tight with worry. Matthew hesitated, then opened the door. Alexandra stood on his doorstep in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. Without the usual polish, she looked younger, more vulnerable. I know what my father did. The words tumbled out in a rush. Getting you fired. It's my fault, and I'm so sorry. Matthew stepped back, allowing her inside more from surprise than intention. Alexandra entered hesitantly, her eyes taking in the small living room with its secondhand furniture, the kitchen table covered in bills, the walls decorated with Nathan's artwork. How did you find my address? Alexandra looked away, guilt crossing her features. My father's investigation. I found the file in his office. The reminder of Sullivan's intrusion into his privacy stung, but Matthew was too tired for anger now. He cleared the bills from the table with a sweep of his arm, gesturing for Alexandra to sit. It doesn't matter. I'll find another job. Not in Chicago, you won't. Alexandra's voice was bitter. Not if my father has anything to say about it. He's making calls using his influence. It's what he does when he feels challenged. The confirmation of what Matthew had already suspected settled like lead in his stomach. He sank into the chair opposite her, suddenly exhausted beyond words. Why are you here, Alexandra? She met his gaze directly, green eyes fierce with determination. To make this right, I have resources of my own. Money my mother left me. Connections my father doesn't control. I can help you find a new job, a better apartment. Matthew shook his head, cutting her off. I don't want your help, or your money. I've been on my own a long time. I'll figure this out. Alexandra's expression hardened, a flash of the steel beneath her gentle exterior. My father is trying to ruin your life because of me, because he thinks you're beneath us. Are you really going to let your pride hurt your son? The question hit with the precision of a sniper's bullet, finding the one vulnerable spot in Matthew's armor. Nathan. Everything he did, every sacrifice was for his boy. Could he really put his pride above his son's welfare? Alexandra seemed to sense his wavering resolve. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. I'm not offering charity, Matthew. I'm offering friendship. There's a difference. Before he could respond, headlights swept across the front window. A car door slammed outside, followed by confident footsteps on the porch. Alexandra tensed her hand, tightening on Matthew's. That's my father's car. Matthew stood moving to the door just as a sharp knock sounded. He opened it to find Richard Sullivan on his doorstep, flanked by a man in a dark suit who was clearly security. Sullivan's cold gaze moved from Matthew to Alexandra, visible at the kitchen table behind him. I thought I might find you here. Sullivan's voice was controlled, but anger simmered beneath the surface. Get in the car, Alexandra. We're leaving. Alexandra remained seated, her chin lifted in defiance. I'm not a child, Dad. You can't order me around anymore. Sullivan's mask of civility slipped, revealing the ruthless businessman beneath. You're making a scene. This isn't the place for this discussion. That's right. Matthew stepped forward, blocking Sullivan's view of Alexandra. This is my home, and you're not welcome in it. For a moment, Sullivan seemed taken aback by the direct challenge. Then his eyes narrowed, reassessing Matthew with calculated intensity. You think this is a game, Hayes? You think you can just insert yourself into our lives? Sullivan's voice dropped, becoming deadly quiet. I've buried better men than you for less. Matthew didn't flinch, didn't step back. He'd faced down warlords in Afghanistan with less at stake than his dignity in this moment. I'm not playing any game, Mr. Sullivan. Your daughter came here to warn me what you've done, costing me my job, blacklisting me across the city, all because you can't stand the thought of someone like me being friends with someone like her. Sullivan's jaw tightened, the only sign that Matthew's words had found their mark. You saved her life. For that, you have my gratitude. But that doesn't entitle you to a place in her world. Alexandra appeared at Matthew's side, her expression a mixture of anger and hurt as she faced her father. It's not your decision who has a place in my world, Dad. Matthew really sees me as a person, not an heiress or a business asset or an extension of you. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Sullivan's gaze softened fractionally as he looked at his daughter. You're naive, sweetheart. Men like Hayes always want something. They see the Sullivan name and fortune, not you. Matthew stepped forward, his patience finally snapping. I didn't even know who she was when I pulled her from that car. I didn't ask for recognition or reward. I just did what was right. But you can't understand that, can you? Because in your world, everything has a price tag. Sullivan's expression hardened again, his eyes glacial as they locked with Matthew's. You have no idea what my world is like, Hayes. You haven't earned the right to judge it or me. I built my empire from nothing. I protect what's mine. Alexandra touched her father's arm, her voice gentler now. Dad, please, this isn't you. Mom wouldn't recognize the man you are becoming. Sullivan flinched as if struck, real pain flashing across his features before the mask slipped back into place. He looked from Alexandra to Matthew, then back again, something calculating, entering his gaze. Very well. He straightened his already impeccable suit jacket. If Mr. Hayes is as honorable as you believe, let him prove it. Matthew crossed his arms, wariness replacing anger. What exactly did you have in mind? Sullivan smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. A test. 3 months working at Sullivan Hotels and Resorts, starting at the bottom, maintenance department. If you're as competent and principled as Alexandra believes, you'll have no trouble demonstrating it. Alexandra started to protest, but Sullivan raised a hand silencing her. You'll use a different name. No one will know your connection to Alexandra or to me. You'll be judged solely on your merits, your work ethic, your character. Pass my test, and I'll not only cease my intervention in your employment prospects, I'll acknowledge your right to associate with my daughter. And if I refuse, Matthew's voice was steady, though his mind raced with implications. Sullivan shrugged this gesture, elegant despite its dismissiveness. Then you confirm every suspicion I have about your interest in my daughter, and I continue to ensure no garage in Chicago will hire you. Dad, this is blackmail. Alexandra's voice was tight with outrage. I prefer to think of it as a business proposition. Sullivan's gaze never left Matthew's face. What do you say, Hayes? Are you man enough to prove me wrong? The challenge hung in the air between them, a gauntlet thrown down on Matthew's own doorstep. Pride urged him to tell Sullivan where he could shove his test. Practicality reminded him of the bills on the table, of Nathan's need for stability, of the rapidly diminishing options before him. And somewhere deeper, a voice whispered that this might be his only chance to prove himself worthy of Alexandra's friendship and perhaps something more. 3 months. Matthew's decision crystallized as he spoke. But I have conditions. My son stays with my sister. I see him weekends. And when I pass your test, you make this right, not just for me, but for Frank Harper and the garage. They shouldn't suffer because of your vendetta. Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise, and perhaps a hint of grudging respect in his expression. Agreed. Though there's one more condition of my own. During these 3 months, you have no contact with Alexandra. None whatsoever. Matthew glanced at Alexandra, saw the protest forming on her lips. He spoke before she could, his voice firm. Fine, as long as you give me your word that this is a fair test. No sabotage, no rigged games. Sullivan extended his hand, his gaze cold and assessing. You have my word as a Sullivan. And unlike some Mr. Hayes, a Sullivan's word actually means something in this world. Matthew took the offered hand, his calloused fingers gripping Sullivan's manicured ones with deliberate firmness. Then I guess we have a deal, Mr. Sullivan. I hope you're ready to be proven wrong. Sullivan's smile was thin, predatory. That's the thing about men like me, Hayes. We never make bets we can't afford to lose. As Sullivan turned to leave, Alexandra moved to Matthew's side, her voice low and urgent. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. Matthew shook his head, watching as Sullivan waited by the expensive car, deliberately giving them a moment of privacy. This is the only way he'll ever see me, as something other than a charity case or a gold digger. I need to do this, Alexandra. For Nathan. For myself. Alexandra's eyes searched, his concern warring with understanding. Be careful. My father doesn't play fair no matter what he says. He hasn't built his empire by being kind. Matthew allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine one of the evening. I've survived worse than your father, Alexandra. Much worse. Alexandra hesitated, then reached up to touch his cheek briefly, the gesture startling in its tenderness. When this is over, when you've shown him who you really are, I'll be waiting. She moved away before he could respond, joining her father by the car. Sullivan's expression remained unreadable as he held the door for his daughter, but his eyes met Matthew's one last time, a silent promise that the coming test would be anything but easy. As the expensive car pulled away, Matthew stood in the doorway of a small rental house, facing a future suddenly filled with new uncertainties. Sullivan's challenge meant a chance to keep Nathan fed and housed a chance to prove himself against a man who saw him as beneath contempt. But it also meant 3 months away from his son, 3 months without seeing Alexandra, 3 months of starting over yet again. The night air was cold against his face, stars visible between the bare branches of the maple tree in his tiny front yard. Matthew Hayes had rebuilt his life once before, climbing back from the edge of destruction after Marie left. He could do it again. He would do it again. For Nathan, for himself, and maybe, just maybe, for the green-eyed woman who saw him as a hero when he'd never felt less like one. Matthew closed the door, returning to the kitchen table with its spread of unpaid bills. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, he felt something that had been missing since the night of the accident purpose. Sullivan's test wasn't just about employment or Alexandra or pride. It was about proving that a man's worth wasn't measured by the size of his bank account, but by the strength of his character. And that was a battle Matthew Hayes had been fighting his entire life. Dawn broke cold and gray over Chicago as Matthew packed the last of his essentials into a duffel bag. The rest would stay here in the small rental house that might not be theirs when the 3 months ended. Nathan sat at the kitchen table pushing cereal around his bowl, unusually quiet. "Dad, what if Mr. Sullivan tricks you?" The boy's voice was small in the silent kitchen. Matthew zipped the duffel closed, keeping his movements deliberate, masking the doubt churning beneath his calm exterior. "Then I'll figure something out. I always do right." Nathan nodded without conviction, his eyes too serious for a 10-year-old. "Sarah said I could bring my PlayStation games to her house, but she doesn't have a PlayStation." The unspoken question hung in the air. Matthew knelt beside his son's chair, one hand resting on the boy's narrow shoulder. "I know this is hard, buddy, but it's just for a little while. 3 months, then we'll be back together. And hey, maybe by Christmas, Santa will figure out the PlayStation situation. Aunt Sarah lives closer to my school at least." Nathan's attempt at optimism broke Matthew's heart. "And she makes better pancakes than you." Matthew forced a laugh, ruffling his son's hair. "That's not saying much. A squirrel could make better pancakes than me." Sarah arrived an hour later, her sensible sedan, a stark contrast to Sullivan's luxury vehicles. Matthew's younger sister had his same dark hair and steady gaze, but where hardship had left him guarded, it had made Sarah more openly compassionate. She hugged Nathan tight, then pulled Matthew aside while the boy gathered his backpack. "You sure about this, Matt? Working for the guy who tried to destroy you?" Her voice was low concern, etching lines around her eyes. Matthew glanced at Nathan, making sure the boy was out of earshot. "It's the only play I've got, Sarah. Sullivan's made sure no garage in the city will hire me. This way, Nathan's taken care of while I figure out our next move." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "Mom and Dad would be proud of you, you know, the way you've stepped up for that boy." Matthew looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "Sullivan's providing an apartment near the hotel during the test. It's just temporary housing for employees, nothing fancy." Sarah squeezed Arthur's arm. "Call me every day. And Matt, be careful. Men like Sullivan don't play fair." The warning echoed Alexandra's from the night before. Matthew nodded, shouldering his duffel as Nathan returned with his things. The goodbye was quick. Matthew had learned in the military that prolonging them only made things harder. One last hug, one last reminder to be good for Aunt Sarah, and then Matthew was in his truck, watching them pull away, his chest tight with an emotion he refused to name. The employee housing turned out to be a bare-bones studio apartment in a building 6 blocks from the Sullivan Plaza Hotel. The furniture was utilitarian: bed dresser, small table with 2 chairs, kitchenette with minimal supplies. But it was clean and warm with hot water and working appliances. Matthew had lived in worse places during his deployments. The next morning, he reported to the hotel's maintenance department, where a balding man with permanent frown lines studied the paperwork Sullivan's people had prepared. According to his new ID badge, Matthew was now Michael Harrison, recently arrived from Denver, with experience in building maintenance, but no connection to the Sullivan empire. Howard Wilson, head of maintenance, looked unimpressed by the new hire. His handshake was brief, his introduction to the department perfunctory. The maintenance area was in the hotel's basement, a warren of workrooms, storage areas, and staff-only corridors that connected to every part of the massive building. While the hotel's public spaces gleamed with marble and crystal, down here the walls were institutional beige, the floors concrete, the lighting fluorescent and harsh. The job itself was straightforward enough. Matthew, now Michael, was assigned to general repairs, fixing leaky faucets, replacing light fixtures, unclogging toilets, repairing minor damage to walls and furniture. The kind of work he could do in his sleep, though the materials were more expensive than he was used to. The other maintenance workers kept their distance that first day, eyeing the newcomer with suspicion. During lunch in the staff cafeteria, Matthew sat alone, observing the strict hierarchy of hotel life. Managers and administrative staff clustered together, housekeeping formed their own groups, often speaking Spanish among themselves, while maintenance and security formed a loose alliance at tables near the back. 3 tables away, a man in an expensive suit sat alone, eating methodically while reviewing documents on a tablet. The others gave him a wide berth, their postures stiffening whenever he glanced up. Walter Reynolds, the head of hotel operations, and Matthew had been informed his ultimate boss. Also, according to the whispers, he'd overheard Richard Sullivan's right-hand man at the Chicago property. Matthew kept his head down, focusing on the work. When his shift ended at 4, he returned to the empty apartment, the silence a stark reminder of Nathan's absence. He called his son as promised, listening to stories about his day at school and Sarah's cat that had decided Nathan's suitcase made the perfect bed. He didn't mention the suspicious glances from coworkers, the grunt work he'd been assigned, or the hollow feeling in his chest each time he passed the hotel's grand entrance and thought of Alexandra. Days passed in a blur of routine. Matthew worked his shifts, keeping to himself, learning the hotel's layout and systems. He fixed what needed fixing without complaint, arrived early, left late, and gradually began to notice things, inefficiencies in the maintenance schedules, wasted materials, shortcuts taken where they shouldn't be. By the end of his second week, he'd earned a grudging respect from some coworkers, particularly an older maintenance worker named Hector, who'd been with the hotel for 30 years. Hector had spotted Matthew improvising a repair on an antique desk lamp that would have cost thousands to replace, using techniques that spoke of experience beyond basic maintenance. "You military," Hector's question came as they worked together on replacing ceiling tiles damaged by a water leak. Matthew tensed, then remembered his cover story. "Yeah, Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan." "Thought so." Hector's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Got the look. My son did 4 years Marines," gets that same expression when the fire alarms test. The simple recognition created a bridge. Hector began to include Matthew in conversations, introducing him to other staff members, sharing the unwritten rules of Sullivan Hotel operations. Through him, Matthew learned about Walter Reynolds' obsession with cutting costs, the pressure from corporate to increase profits year over year, and most interestingly, the frequent visits from Richard Sullivan himself, who kept a penthouse suite permanently reserved for his use. It was during his third week that Matthew encountered his first real test. He'd been assigned to repair some damage to a wall in one of the luxury suites, a simple patch and paint job. As he worked, he overheard an argument in the connecting room between Walter Reynolds and the head of hotel security. "The fire system inspections are flagging too many issues." Reynolds' voice was sharp with irritation. "Sullivan's coming for the quarterly review next week. I don't want any red flags." The security chief's response was lower concerned. "These aren't cosmetic problems, Walter. The sprinkler system on floors 15 through 18 isn't up to code. The pressure's too low. If there's a fire, we'll address it after the review." Reynolds cut him off. "Sullivan wants profit margins up 10%, not reports about expensive infrastructure upgrades. Delay the inspection report." The conversation shifted to other matters, but Matthew had heard enough. The implications were clear and dangerous. 4 floors of the hotel had compromised fire suppression systems, and management was deliberately concealing the problem. If a fire broke out, lives could be lost. That night, Matthew lay awake in his sparse apartment, weighing his options. Reporting the issue directly would reveal he'd been eavesdropping and likely get him fired before Sullivan's test was complete. Ignoring it could mean putting hotel guests at risk. The ethical choice was clear, but the execution complicated. The next morning, he arrived an hour early for his shift and headed straight for the fire control room. Using the maintenance keys he'd been issued, Matthew ran his own inspection of the sprinkler system, methodically documenting the pressure readings for each floor. The security chief had been right. Floors 15 through 18 showed dangerously low pressure, well below code requirements. Armed with this information, Matthew created a maintenance request form, citing an unrelated issue: water pressure fluctuations affecting guest room showers on the upper floors. He included the sprinkler system data as supporting evidence suggesting the problems might be connected, then submitted the form through proper channels. The documentation would be impossible to ignore without explicit negligence, forcing action without directly challenging Reynolds' authority. 3 days later, Matthew was called to Howard Wilson's office. The maintenance director looked uncomfortable, shifting papers on his desk without meeting Matthew's eyes. "You submitted this work order about the water pressure issues." Wilson pushed the form across the desk. Matthew kept his expression neutral. "Yes, sir. I noticed the fluctuations while working on the Magnolia Suite. Thought it might indicate a larger system problem." Wilson's frown deepened. "You were hired to fix what you're told to fix, Harrison, not go looking for problems." Matthew leaned forward slightly. "With respect, sir, if those pressure readings are accurate, it's not just about guest comfort. It affects the fire suppression systems too." Wilson flinched, glancing toward the closed door as if afraid someone might be listening. "That's not your concern." "Actually, sir, it is." Matthew held the older man's gaze. If there's a fire and those sprinklers fail, people could die. That makes it everyone's concern. A moment of tense silence stretched between them. Then Wilson sighed, the stern facade crumbling to reveal something more vulnerable. Reynolds has been cutting maintenance budgets for 3 years running. The fixes needed are expensive. Corporate keeps demanding higher profits, fewer expenses. Matthew recognized the dilemma of a man caught between safety and job security. So we work around it, document everything, create a paper trail no one can ignore. Wilson studied him with new interest. You're not what I expected when Reynolds said we were getting a new guy. The comment hung in the air, loaded with implication. Matthew filed it away. Reynolds had specifically known about his hiring. Another piece of the puzzle that was Sullivan's test. That afternoon, Matthew was reassigned from general repairs to system maintenance, a subtle promotion that gave him access to more critical hotel infrastructure. The message was clear: he'd passed some initial evaluation, but the real challenges were just beginning. The weekend came bringing Matthew's first chance to see Nathan since starting at the hotel. Sarah brought the boy to his apartment, hovering uncertainly in the doorway as Nathan explored the small space. It's like a secret agent headquarters, Dad. The boy's enthusiasm was a balm to Matthew's spirit. Do you have any missions yet? Matthew caught his sister's worried glance and forced a smile. Just keeping the hotel running, buddy. Nothing exciting? They spent the day at a nearby park, then caught a discount matinee movie. Matthew stretched his budget to treat Nathan to pizza afterward, listening as the boy chattered about school and friends and the science project he was working on with Sarah's help. In those few hours, the weight of Sullivan's test lifted, and Matthew remembered what he was fighting for. As they said goodbye that evening, Nathan hugged him fiercely. I miss you, Dad, but Aunt Sarah said you're doing important work, that sometimes men have to do hard things to take care of their families. The simple truth in his son's words nearly undid Matthew. He swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. I miss you too, bud, more than you know. After they left, the apartment felt emptier than before, the silence heavier. Matthew found himself thinking of Alexandra, wondering what she was doing if she thought of him. The no-contact rule of Sullivan's test felt increasingly like another form of manipulation, a way to isolate him from potential allies. Monday brought the development Matthew had been anticipating. Richard Sullivan arrived at the hotel for his quarterly review. The entire staff was on edge, supervisors conducting last-minute inspections, housekeeping, working overtime to ensure every surface gleamed. Matthew caught a glimpse of the billionaire striding through the lobby, Walter Reynolds hovering at his side like an anxious courtier. Sullivan looked exactly as he had that night at Matthew's door, commanding, coldly confident, a man accustomed to bending the world to his will. Matthew kept his distance, focusing on his assigned tasks. But at lunch, he was surprised when Hector slid into the seat across from him, expression unusually grave. Reynolds is looking for you, wants you in the penthouse suite. Now. Matthew's fork paused halfway to his mouth. The penthouse, Sullivan's private quarters. Hector nodded, leaning closer. Word is the big man himself requested you specifically. No one gets called up there unless they're being promoted or fired. The elevator ride to the top floor gave Matthew precious minutes to prepare himself. This confrontation had been inevitable from the moment he'd accepted Sullivan's challenge. Now it would determine whether he continued the test or was summarily dismissed. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the Sullivan Plaza, accessible only by key card or express permission from hotel management. The security guard at the private elevator bank checked Matthew's ID badge twice before allowing him to proceed. Unlike the rest of the hotel with its classic luxury, the penthouse was aggressively modern. All clean lines, open spaces, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Richard Sullivan stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, gazing out at the city spread below like a personal kingdom. Walter Reynolds hovered nearby, his expression a careful blank. Neither man turned as Matthew entered. Michael Harrison, maintenance staff, reporting as requested, sir. Only then did Sullivan turn his gaze, coolly assessing as it swept over Matthew's uniform. Behind the practiced nonchalance, Matthew detected a flicker of surprise. Perhaps Sullivan had expected him to quit, already to buckle under the pressure of separation from Nathan and the tedium of basic maintenance work. Mr. Harrison. Sullivan gestured to a document on the glass coffee table. Would you care to explain this? Matthew approached, recognizing the work order he'd submitted about the water pressure issues, the one that had obliquely highlighted the fire safety violations. He kept his voice neutral, professional. It's a maintenance request, sir. Water pressure inconsistencies affecting guest rooms and safety systems. Safety systems. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. You've been here less than a month and you're already identifying infrastructure concerns that my hotel manager assures me are well in hand. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his expression hardening as he glared at Matthew. Sullivan continued moving toward a nearby bar cart to pour himself a drink. Tell me, Mr. Harrison, do you make a habit of overstepping your assigned duties? Matthew met the billionaire's gaze directly. I make a habit of doing my job thoroughly, sir. Safety concerns affect guest experience, which affects the hotel's reputation. I assumed management would want to address potential problems before they become actual ones. Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. A diplomatic answer. He sipped his whiskey, studying Matthew over the rim of the crystal glass. Reynolds assures me you're being unnecessarily cautious, that the pressure variances are within acceptable ranges. Matthew didn't flinch. Then Mr. Reynolds won't mind if I show you the actual readings compared to municipal fire code requirements. Reynolds stepped forward, interjecting quickly. That won't be necessary. We've already scheduled the upgrades based on Harrison's report. Implementation begins next week. The hotel manager's hasty response confirmed what Matthew suspected. Reynolds had hoped to bury the issue, but Matthew's documentation had made that impossible. Sullivan glanced between the two men, something calculating in his expression. I see. His tone revealed nothing of his thoughts. Well, since you're here, Harrison, perhaps you can assist with another matter. The shower in my private quarters has a persistent drip. Fix it. The abrupt dismissal was clearly meant to put Matthew in his place from potential whistleblower to basic repairman in an instant. Reynolds looked relieved, likely assuming the crisis had passed. Matthew simply nodded, accepting the directive without comment. The real message beneath Sullivan's words was clear. The test continued. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Matthew would identify issues with hotel systems or practices, document them thoroughly, and submit them through proper channels. Sometimes the problems were addressed, sometimes ignored, but each report built a paper trail that couldn't easily be dismissed. Reynolds began to view Matthew with undisguised hostility, assigning him increasingly difficult or unpleasant tasks, clearing clogged waistlines, crawling through dusty ventilation shafts, night shifts, handling emergency calls. If the intention was to break Matthew's resolve, it failed. He approached each assignment with the same quiet competence, the same attention to detail. Gradually, Matthew earned the respect of the maintenance staff, who began coming to him with their own concerns about hotel operations. He learned about corners being cut, about safety checks being falsified, about a systematic prioritization of profit over safety and staff welfare. The revelations were troubling, but not surprising. This was the world Sullivan had built: efficient and profitable, but fundamentally flawed. One evening, working late to repair an electrical panel, Matthew encountered a hotel guest wandering the service corridors, clearly lost. The man was expensively dressed, slightly drunk, and irritated at finding himself in the utilitarian back areas of the hotel. This doesn't look like the executive lounge. The guest's words slurred slightly, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light as he gestured dismissively. Matthew set down his tools. No, sir, you've taken a wrong turn. Let me escort you back to the main elevators. The guest squinted at Matthew's uniform, then laughed. Sullivan's famous service excellence extends even to the grease monkeys. Huh? How touching. Matthew kept his expression neutral, guiding the intoxicated man toward the guest areas. The guest continued, warming to his topic. You know what they say about old Richard, right? Sullivan hotels, where the sheets are Egyptian cotton and the employee contracts are toilet paper. The man chuckled at his own wit. Worked with him on the Denver acquisition. Brilliant businessman, absolute shark. Wouldn't want to be on his bad side. Matthew said nothing, maintaining professional courtesy as they reached the main corridor. The guest paused before heading toward the lounge, studying Matthew with sudden drunken intensity. Word of advice, maintenance man. If Sullivan ever offers you a test, fail it. Those who pass just get harder tests until they break anyway. The encounter lingered in Matthew's mind long after his shift ended. Back in his apartment, he reviewed what he'd learned about Sullivan's operation during his weeks at the hotel. The systemic issues, the culture of fear Reynolds cultivated, the constant pressure to increase profits while cutting costs. Yet guests experienced only luxury and efficiency, the machinery of exploitation hidden behind marble facades and impeccable service. Matthew's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. Nathan's had an asthma attack. Her voice was tight with controlled fear. We're at Chicago Memorial. It's bad, Matt. Worse than the one last year. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of dread. Matthew was already grabbing his keys, heading for the door. "I'm on my way." The hospital's emergency room was bright and chaotic, a stark contrast to the ordered luxury of the Sullivan Plaza. Matthew found Sarah in a waiting area, her face drawn with worry. Nathan had been taken for treatment, she explained. The doctors were working to stabilize his breathing. They needed family medical history, insurance information, details Matthew had always handled. Hours passed in the sterile waiting room. Matthew paced, answered doctors' questions, filled out forms, his mind replaying every previous asthma attack Nathan had experienced. Each time had been frightening, but this was different. The doctor's expression had been grave when discussing the severity, the potential need for more aggressive treatment if Nathan's condition didn't improve. Past midnight, a nurse finally led Matthew to Nathan's bedside. The boy looked impossibly small beneath the hospital blankets and oxygen mask covering his face, monitors beeping steadily beside him. His eyes fluttered open when Matthew took his hand. "Hey, buddy." Matthew fought to keep his voice steady to project confidence he didn't feel. "You gave us quite a scare." Nathan's fingers tightened weakly around his. "Sorry, Dad. I tried to use my inhaler like you showed me, but it wasn't helping." "You did everything right." Matthew smoothed the boy's hair back from his forehead. "The doctors are taking good care of you. You'll be feeling better soon." The doctor had been less optimistic during their brief conversation in the hallway. Nathan's condition was stabilized but serious. He would need to remain hospitalized for at least 3 days, possibly longer. And there was the matter of the bill. Even with Matthew's basic insurance, the cost would be substantial. Costs he couldn't afford, especially not with the precarious employment situation Sullivan's test had created. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression softening at the sight of father and son together. "A nurse wants to check his vitals. And there's someone here to see you, Matt, in the waiting room." Matthew frowned, reluctant to leave Nathan's side. "Who knows I'm here?" Sarah shook her head, equally confused. "Some lawyer type. Says it's important." In the waiting area, a woman in a tailored suit stood as Matthew approached. She was in her 40s with sharp eyes and the composed manner of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for speaking with me. I represent the Sullivan family." Matthew tensed, instantly wary. "How did you find me here?" The woman's expression remained professionally neutral. "Ms. Sullivan was concerned about your son. She asked me to check local hospitals when you couldn't be reached at your apartment." Alexandra. The mention of her name sent a complicated surge of emotions through Matthew. She'd been monitoring him despite Sullivan's no-contact rule. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. The lawyer continued, her tone matter of fact. "I've been authorized to handle all medical expenses for your son. The Sullivan family has arrangements with this hospital. Nathan will receive the best possible care in a private room with specialists if needed." Matthew's pride warred with practicality. Nathan needed the care. He couldn't afford it. But accepting Sullivan money felt dangerously like conceding defeat. "This isn't about Mr. Sullivan's test." The lawyer seemed to read his hesitation. "Ms. Sullivan was quite insistent. She considers it her personal obligation given the circumstances that led to your current situation." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion and worry making it hard to think clearly. "Tell Alexandra thank you. But make it clear this doesn't change anything about the agreement with her father." The lawyer nodded, satisfied with the response. "There's one more thing. Mr. Sullivan is aware of the situation. He's authorized a leave of absence from your hotel duties until your son is recovered. Your position will be held for you." Matthew studied the woman, trying to decipher Sullivan's angle in this unexpected gesture. "Is this part of the test too?" For the first time, the lawyer's professional mask slipped, revealing a hint of genuine emotion. "Mr. Sullivan lost his wife 2 years ago after a prolonged illness. He was at her bedside throughout. Whatever else you may think of him, Mr. Hayes, he understands what it means to watch someone you love suffer." The insight into Sullivan's personal tragedy cast the man's actions in a new light. Not justifying his methods perhaps, but explaining some of the ruthless protectiveness he displayed toward Alexandra. Matthew nodded, accepting both the financial help and the leave of absence. Nathan's welfare had to come before pride or principles. The following days blurred into a cycle of hospital rooms, doctor consultations, and stolen moments of sleep in uncomfortable chairs. Nathan improved gradually, his breathing easing, his color returning. The private room Sullivan's influence had secured was spacious and quiet, the medical care exemplary. Matthew tried not to think about what the bill would have been without Alexandra's intervention, focusing instead on his son's recovery. On the third day, as Nathan napped after lunch, Matthew stepped into the hallway to stretch his legs. A familiar figure stood by the nurse's station, Walter Reynolds, his usual immaculate suit looking oddly out of place among the medical staff in scrubs. Harrison, the hotel manager, approached, his expression unreadable. Or should I say haze? Matthew stiffened, glancing toward Nathan's room, instinctively protective. What are you doing here, Reynolds? Checking on Sullivan's pet project. Reynolds kept his voice low, a cold smile playing at his lips. Did you really think we didn't know who you were from the beginning? The whole maintenance staff has been briefed. They've been reporting on you daily. The revelation shouldn't have been surprising. Sullivan's reach was vast, his resources unlimited. Of course, the test had been controlled from the start, yet the confirmation still stung, the sense of being watched and evaluated without his knowledge. So the fire safety issues, the cost-cutting, all part of the test. Matthew's hands clenched at his sides. Reynolds smirked. Some real, some manufactured. Sullivan wanted to see how you'd respond, whether you'd be a team player or a troublemaker. And which am I? Matthew held the manager's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. Reynolds glanced toward Nathan's room, something calculating in his expression. That depends on what happens when you return. If you return. Sullivan's generosity only extends so far, Hayes. Remember who's paying for that private room, those specialists? Remember who holds your future in his hands. The implicit threat hung in the air between them. Reynolds straightened his tie, satisfied he'd made his point. I'll let Mr. Sullivan know the boy's improving. He'll be pleased. After Reynolds departed, Matthew stood motionless in the hospital corridor, fury and helplessness warring within him. The game had shifted. Sullivan wasn't just testing his work ethic or integrity, he was demonstrating the power imbalance between them, the ease with which he could control Matthew's circumstances, even his son's health care. That evening, as Nathan slept, Matthew made a decision. He pulled out his phone and composed a text message to the number Alexandra's lawyer had provided for emergencies. Need to speak with you, not about Nathan, about your father's test. The response came within minutes. An address, a time, tomorrow evening, nothing more. The following day brought good news. Nathan was well enough to be discharged. The doctors prescribed new medications, a follow-up appointment, and strict rest at home. Sarah arrived to help, her relief evident as she hugged her nephew. Matthew arranged for Nathan to stay with her another week just to be safe, promising to visit daily. That evening, Matthew found himself in an upscale coffee shop in a neighborhood far from both the Sullivan Plaza and his temporary apartment. Alexandra was already there when he arrived, seated at a corner table, a scarf partially obscuring her face despite the warm interior. She looked up as he approached, her green eyes brightening with relief and something more complex. Matthew. She stood as he reached the table, hesitating briefly before embracing him. How is Nathan? Is he really okay? Matthew returned the embrace, surprised by how natural it felt despite their weeks apart. He's doing much better. Thank you for what you did. The medical care, the private room, it made a difference. Alexandra waved away his gratitude, gesturing for him to sit. It was the least I could do considering why you're in this situation to begin with. My father's ridiculous test. Reynolds came to the hospital. He made it clear the whole thing has been a setup from the beginning. Every staff member reporting on me, some problems, real, some created, just to see how I'd respond. Alexandra's expression darkened with anger. That sounds like my father. He doesn't believe in fair fights, only winning. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Listen, Matthew, there's something you need to know. This test, it's not what you think. It's not just about whether you're good enough for me or even whether you can handle working at Sullivan Hotels. Matthew tensed, sensing the revelation coming would change everything. What is it then? Alexandra met his gaze directly, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. My father is dying, pancreatic cancer. He has maybe a year left at most. He's looking for someone to trust with parts of his empire. Someone with integrity, work ethic, practical knowledge. Someone who can't be bought. The news landed like a physical blow. Sullivan, the seemingly invincible titan, facing his mortality. The test taking on dimensions Matthew hadn't imagined. That's why he was so interested in the fire safety reports. Alexandra continued, in how you handled ethical dilemmas. It wasn't just about hotel operations. He's been watching how you solve problems, how you lead without authority, how you balance competing priorities. Matthew shook his head, trying to process this new reality. Why me? He hates everything about me. My background, my job, my life. Alexandra's hand covered his on the table, her touch warm and steady. Because I chose you. Because you saved me when you had nothing to gain. And because my father, for all his faults, recognizes what he once was in you. A silence fell between them, heavy with implication. Outside the coffee shop window, Chicago continued its evening rhythm, unaware of the lives being reshaped within. When Matthew finally spoke, his voice was low with determination. I didn't sign up for this, Alexandra. I'm not playing your father's succession games. I just want my life back, my job, my house, my son. On my terms, not his. Alexandra squeezed his hand, gently, understanding in her eyes. Then tell him that. Finish the test on your terms. Show him who you really are, not who he's trying to make you become. As Matthew left the coffee shop, the city lights reflected in puddles from an earlier rain, creating mirror worlds beneath his feet. Alexandra's revelation had changed everything and nothing. Sullivan's test continued, but now Matthew understood the true stakes and knew exactly what he needed to do. Matthew returned to the Sullivan Plaza Hotel on Monday morning, his decision crystallized after the meeting with Alexandra. Her revelation about her father's cancer diagnosis had changed his perspective, but not his resolve. Sullivan wasn't just testing a potential son-in-law, he was evaluating a potential successor. The knowledge should have been flattering, perhaps even tempting. Instead, it reinforced his determination to complete this test on his own terms, not by becoming what the billionaire wanted, but by showing him a different kind of strength. Howard Wilson greeted Matthew's return with visible relief, shoving a stack of work orders across his desk. Sprinkler systems on 15 through 18 still acting up. Reynolds keeps postponing the full repair. Says we need to make budget this quarter. Matthew took the orders, scanning the technical details. Same issue I documented last month. Nothing's been fixed. Wilson shifted uncomfortably, lowering his voice. Temporary patches. Band-aids. Reynolds is under pressure from above. End of fiscal year approaching. Above. Sullivan himself. Matthew nodded his understanding, tucking the work orders into his pocket. I'll take care of it. The meaning behind this simple statement stretched far beyond the immediate repairs. In that moment, Matthew committed to seeing this through, not for Sullivan's approval, not for a position in his empire, but because people's safety was at stake. Matthew spent the day inspecting the problematic sprinkler systems, methodically documenting the deficiencies. The issues were worse than before. Reynolds' temporary fixes had created new problems, increasing the risk of system failure in a real emergency. What had begun as a cost-cutting measure had evolved into a genuine safety hazard. That evening, instead of returning to his temporary apartment, he made his way to the hotel's operations center. The night shift security guard recognized him, nodding a greeting as Matthew badged in. Need to check some readings on the fire suppression system, Matthew said, keeping his tone casual. Inconsistent pressure on the upper floors. The guard barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle. Knock yourself out. Coffee's fresh if you want some. Alone at the main control panel, Matthew reviewed the system data, confirming what his physical inspection had already told him. Then, making sure the security cameras couldn't capture his actions, he made a subtle adjustment to the sprinkler system settings. Nothing dangerous, just enough to trigger warning alerts on the building management system, forcing documentation that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, Reynolds summoned Matthew to his office, his face tight with controlled fury. The fire marshal's office called. Someone anonymously reported potential violations in our sprinkler systems. They've scheduled a surprise inspection for tomorrow. Matthew met the manager's accusing glare without flinching. Maybe it's for the best, sir. The system needs proper repairs, not temporary fixes, before someone gets hurt. Reynolds leaned across his desk, voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I know it was you, Harrison. Or should I say Hayes, this little crusade of yours is going to cost the hotel hundreds of thousands in repairs and potential fines. Safety doesn't have a price tag, Matthew kept his voice level. Neither does doing the right thing. Reynolds' laugh held no humor. Spare me the Boy Scout routine. Sullivan might be impressed with your moral stand, but I see right through it. You're playing a game you don't understand. The warning hung in the air between them. Matthew stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. Reynolds finally waved a dismissive hand toward the door. Get out and stay available. When Sullivan hears about this inspection, he'll want answers. Just before the end of his shift, Matthew received a text message from an unknown number, penthouse now. The express elevator ride to the top floor seemed shorter than before. This time, Matthew knew what awaited him, not just Richard Sullivan's cold assessment, but a confrontation that would determine his future. The penthouse was silent when Matthew entered, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing a spectacular sunset over Chicago. Sullivan stood in the center of the vast living area, looking smaller, somehow, less imposing than in previous encounters. Whether it was knowing about his illness or simply Matthew's evolving perspective, the billionaire seemed more human now, more vulnerable despite his power. You've created quite a situation, Hayes. Sullivan didn't turn as Matthew approached, his gaze fixed on the city spread below them. The fire marshal, the inspection, the potential violations. Matthew stopped several feet away. The sprinkler system on 4 floors is compromised. It's a serious safety issue that's been ignored for months. Sullivan turned then, studying Matthew with an intensity that seemed to strip away pretenses. And you took it upon yourself to force action against direct orders from hotel management. Yes, sir, I did. Why? Sullivan's question was deceptively simple. Not an accusation, but a genuine inquiry. The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken implications. Matthew considered his words carefully. Because I wouldn't be able to look my son in the eye if I stood by and did nothing. Because integrity isn't something you can turn on and off based on who's signing your paycheck. Because I'd rather lose this job than lose myself. Sullivan's expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle relaxation as if some private calculation had been confirmed. He moved to a nearby bar cart, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into crystal tumblers. Alexandra told you about my condition. He handed 1 glass to Matthew, the action oddly personal after weeks of hierarchical distance. I should be angry, but I find I'm too tired for that particular emotion these days. Matthew accepted the drink without comment, waiting as Sullivan settled into a leather armchair, gesturing for Matthew to do the same. The silence between them wasn't comfortable exactly, but it had lost some of its earlier hostility. I built an empire on being the hardest, shrewdest player in every room. Sullivan swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Made billions, crushed competitors, survived 3 market crashes and 2 divorce attorneys who promised to take everything. He looked up, meeting Matthew's gaze directly. And now I find myself with 6 months to a year left, according to the specialists, in a daughter who deserves better than the shark circling my legacy. Matthew took a small sip of the whiskey. I'm sorry about your diagnosis, but with respect, sir, I'm not sure what that has to do with me. Sullivan's laugh was short, genuine. Direct, that's what Alexandra sees in you, I suppose. No games, no pretense. He set his glass down, leaning forward. What if I told you I've been impressed with your performance during this test? That your actions today with the fire marshal, while costly and inconvenient, confirmed what I suspected about your character. The conversation was veering into dangerous territory. Matthew felt the pull of Sullivan's approval, a powerful force he hadn't expected to affect him, and consciously resisted it. I'd say you have a strange way of showing approval. Getting me fired from Harper's. Threatening my ability to support my son. Separating me from Nathan and Alexandra for months. Sullivan didn't flinch from the accusations, accepting them with a slight nod. Extreme measures for extreme circumstances. I needed to know who you really are, Hayes. Not who you pretend to be when things are easy, but who you become when everything is at stake. Matthew set his barely touched drink aside, a decision crystallizing within him. Now you know. I'm the same person I was the night I pulled Alexandra from that car. Just a man trying to do what's right, take care of his son, and live with himself. If that's not enough for your test, then I fail. Gladly. For the first time, genuine surprise registered on Sullivan's face, quickly masked behind his practiced control. Most men would be angling for advantage at this point. Sensing an opportunity, you're walking away. Matthew stood, the finality of his decision bringing unexpected clarity. I never wanted your empire, Mr. Sullivan. I don't want your hotels or your money or your power. I just want my life back. My job at Harper's, my house, time with my son. Sullivan remained seated, studying Matthew with new intensity. And Alexandra, you're walking away from her too. The question struck at the core of Matthew's conflict, the growing feelings he couldn't deny complicated by the gulf between them. He chose honesty over calculation. That's her choice to make, not mine, and certainly not yours. Sullivan stood, slowly moving to the windows again, his reflection ghostly against the darkening sky. My wife Elizabeth died of pancreatic cancer 2 years ago, the same diagnosis I received 4 months back. She fought for 18 months, the bravest thing I've ever witnessed. The unexpected personal revelation hung in the silence. Sullivan continued, his voice softer. Before she died, she made me promise to look after Alexandra, to make sure she didn't end up with someone who would hurt her, use her, or see only the Sullivan fortune instead of our daughter. Matthew remained silent, sensing there was more Sullivan needed to say. The older man turned, his composure slipping just enough to reveal genuine emotion. I've spent 2 years terrifying every man who came near Alexandra, testing them, pushing them, watching them fail. His voice carried the weight of reluctant truth. Then she meets you, a mechanic with military service, a single father drowning in debt, a man with nothing to offer but his character, and suddenly she's happier than I've seen her since before her mother's diagnosis. Sullivan's frustration was evident in the tight lines around his mouth. I don't understand you, Hayes. I've offered you money, threatened your livelihood, dangled opportunity in front of you. Nothing moves you from this principled center. It's like trying to bribe gravity. The comparison startled a short laugh from Matthew. Is that what you want in Alexandra's life? Someone who can be bought, manipulated, controlled. Sullivan's expression hardened momentarily, then softened with reluctant respect. No, it's not. It's just what I understand. A gentle chime from Sullivan's phone interrupted the moment. The billionaire glanced at the screen, his expression changing instantly to controlled alarm. He moved swiftly to a wall-mounted panel activating security monitors. On one screen, smoke billowed from a room on the 16th floor, one of the floors with the compromised sprinkler systems. Fire alarm in the Madison suite. Sullivan's voice was tight with focus. System shows sprinklers activated, but pressure readings are inconsistent. He answered a ringing phone, listening briefly before issuing rapid directives. Full evacuation protocol, all guests, all staff, and get the fire department here now. He turned to Matthew, professional mask firmly in place. This is why we have protocols, Hayes. This is why we have chains of command. If Reynolds had... His sentence was cut off as the lights flickered. A moment later, the fire alarm began to blare throughout the building, its pulsing wail audible even in the penthouse's insulated luxury. Matthew moved toward the door, emergency training taking over. You need to evacuate Mr. Sullivan. I'll help coordinate on the affected floors. Sullivan shook his head, already reaching for his suit jacket. My hotel, my responsibility. I'm coming with you. They descended 26 flights to reach the fire floor using the emergency stairwell. Sullivan kept pace surprisingly well for a man his age, especially one with advanced cancer. Only the tightness around his eyes betrayed the physical toll of the rapid descent. The 16th floor was chaos when they arrived. Smoke filled the corridor, reducing visibility to mere feet. The sprinklers were activating sporadically, some working at full pressure, others barely misting. Hotel staff were directing guests toward the stairs, their training evident, despite the frightening circumstances. Matthew grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher, moving instinctively toward the source of the smoke, the Madison suite at the end of the hall. Sullivan followed, pulling a handkerchief over his mouth and nose as protection against the thickening smoke. Inside the suite, an electrical fire had started in the wall, likely due to faulty wiring. The flames had spread to nearby curtains and furniture, creating a dangerous flashpoint. The sprinklers above the area were among those malfunctioning, providing inadequate suppression. Matthew tackled the flames with the extinguisher while Sullivan helped an elderly couple from the adjoining bedroom, guiding them toward the exit. The fire was small enough that the extinguisher made an impact, but Matthew knew they had minutes at most before the situation escalated. As Sullivan returned from escorting the guests out, a loud crack echoed through the suite. Matthew looked up to see a section of the ceiling beginning to give way, weakened by heat and water damage. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, shoving Sullivan clear as the debris came crashing down. Pain exploded across Matthew's shoulders as a ceiling beam struck him, driving him to his knees. The world narrowed to pinpricks of light amid smoke and pain. He was vaguely aware of Sullivan's shouting, of hands gripping his arms, pulling him upright and toward the door. The corridor outside was barely recognizable now, thick smoke reducing visibility to almost nothing. Matthew stumbled, his left leg nearly buckling beneath him. Sullivan's arm came around his waist, taking his weight with surprising strength. Stay with me, Hayes. Sullivan's voice cut through the haze of pain and smoke. One foot in front of the other. That's an order. The journey to the stairwell was a blur of pain and determination. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder as emergency services responded to the alarm. At the stairwell, they encountered firefighters ascending to battle the blaze. Professional hands took over, supporting Matthew as they continued down. Outside, the night air was shockingly cold and clean after the smoke. Paramedics swarmed around them, separating the two men for medical assessment. Through a haze of emergency activity, Matthew caught glimpses of Sullivan refusing oxygen, directing hotel staff, conferring with fire officials. The billionaire seemed transformed by the crisis, his cold authority replaced by genuine leadership and concern. The paramedics insisted on taking Matthew to the hospital despite his protests. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Sullivan appeared at his side, clasping his shoulder briefly. "You saved my life in there. Again." Sullivan's expression was unreadable in the flashing emergency lights. "We're not finished, you and I." Before Matthew could respond, the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away from the chaotic scene. The hospital visit was a blur of examinations and x-rays. By morning, Matthew had been cleared of serious injury, no concussion, no broken bones, just deep bruising and minor smoke inhalation. Sarah arrived to drive him back to his temporary apartment. "Twice in 1 month, I get calls about you being in the hospital," she said, helping him into the passenger seat. "You're going to give me gray hair before my time." Matthew managed a tired smile. "Next time I'll try getting trapped in a burning building when it's more convenient for your schedule." Sarah's laugh was half sob. "Nathan's been asking about you. I told him you were working late, didn't want to scare him." "Good call. I'll see him this weekend, explain these." Matthew gestured to the visible bandages on his arms. "Tell him it's all part of the job." Sleep claimed him when they reached his apartment, deep and dreamless from exhaustion and medication. He awoke to late afternoon sunlight and the sound of someone at his door. Wincing with each movement, Matthew made his way across the apartment. Alexandra stood in this hallway, her face pale with worry, her green eyes widening at his bandaged appearance. Without a word, she stepped forward, wrapping her arms gently around him, careful of his injuries. The embrace lasted longer than any they'd shared before a physical expression of the fear and relief neither put into words. Inside the apartment, Alexandra moved with quiet efficiency, making tea, adjusting pillows to support Matthew's injured back, her presence filling the empty spaces of the temporary housing. "The doctor said you have second-degree burns on your hands." Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled slightly as she handed him tea. "And bruised ribs, and smoke inhalation. You could have died." Matthew accepted the tea, the warmth seeping into his aching hands. "Your father was in that suite too." What was I supposed to do? Let the ceiling fall on him. Alexandra sat beside him on the couch, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "My father called me this morning. He said something I never thought I'd hear. I was wrong about Hayes. Coming from Richard Sullivan, that's practically a papal blessing." Matthew's short laugh sent a stab of pain through his bruised ribs. "What exactly was he wrong about?" Alexandra turned to face him fully. "Everything. Your motives, your character. What you want from me, from him." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Matthew set his tea aside, meeting her gaze directly. "What I want has never changed, Alexandra. Not since the day you walked into Harper's garage. I want to be seen for who I am, not what I own or what I can provide. I want Nathan to grow up with integrity and compassion. I want to wake up each morning able to face myself in the mirror." Alexandra's hand found his, her touch gentle against the bandages. "And where do I fit in those wants?" The question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. Matthew allowed himself to voice the truth he'd been holding back. "Everywhere, in ways that terrify me. Because wanting you means accepting a world I don't understand with rules I don't play by. It means risking Nathan's heart as well as my own. It means believing that what's between us is stronger than the differences that separate us." Alexandra's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "Those differences, the money, the background, the privilege, they're not who I am. They're circumstances I was born into. The real me is the woman who burnt cookies trying to impress you, who helps Nathan with his science projects, who feels more alive in your garage than at any gala." She leaned forward, her hand rising to touch his face. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. You're the first person who just wanted me. Just Alexandra." The kiss was gentle, mindful of Matthew's injuries, yet conveying a depth of emotion that transcended the physical connection. A discreet knock at the door interrupted the moment. Alexandra stepped away reluctantly as Matthew called for the visitor to enter. Richard Sullivan stood in the doorway, looking strangely out of place in the modest apartment despite his perfectly tailored suit. His gaze moved from Matthew to Alexandra, taking in their proximity. "I see you violated the no-contact rule of our agreement." Sullivan's tone was dry but lacked the cutting edge of their previous interactions. "Though under the circumstances, I suppose I can overlook it." He entered without waiting for an invitation, surveying the sparse furnishings with a businessman's assessing eye. "The doctor's report you'll make a full recovery. Good. We have matters to discuss." Matthew straightened despite the pain in his back, instinctively responding to the authority in Sullivan's voice. Alexandra remained close, her presence both supportive and defiant. If this is about the test, Mr. Sullivan, I've made my position clear. I'm not interested in joining your corporate structure. I just want my life back. Sullivan's expression shifted, a complexity of emotions passing across features normally schooled to reveal nothing. He moved to the apartment's single window looking out at the city. The fire marshal's report came in this morning. The sprinkler system failed precisely as you predicted. If you hadn't forced the issue, the fire would have spread to at least 3 more suites. He turned back to face them, looking older, the weight of his illness evident. The potential loss of life. He trailed off, then continued with unexpected candor. I've spent 40 years building an empire, Hayes. Created wealth beyond what my father, a factory worker in Detroit, could have imagined. Became the man I thought I needed to be to succeed in a ruthless world. Sullivan moved closer, his gaze intent. But last night, trapped in that burning suite, I realized something. All my wealth, all my power, all my connections, none of it mattered. What mattered was the character of the man beside me. A man who had every reason to leave me to face the consequences of my own cost-cutting decisions, yet risked his life to save mine. Alexandra's hand found Matthew's, a silent show of support, as her father continued. I came here today to tell you the test is over, Hayes. You've passed in ways I never anticipated. The job at Harper's Garage is yours again. I've already spoken to Frank. The increased rent on your house has been reversed. Your medical bills, consider them handled. You're free to return to your life exactly as you requested. Matthew kept his voice level, wary of hidden conditions. And what's the catch, Mr. Sullivan? Sullivan's laugh held genuine amusement. The catch, as you put it, is that I find myself in an unusual position. After spending 3 months trying to prove you weren't good enough for my daughter, I now face the distinct possibility that she isn't good enough for you. Alexandra gasped softly at her father's words, but Sullivan continued, addressing her directly. I don't mean your character, Alexandra. I've never doubted that. But Hayes here has something we Sullivans lost somewhere between the first million and the first billion: perspective. The ability to see what really matters. Sullivan returned his attention to Matthew. I won't insult you by offering a corporate position again, but I would like to propose a partnership of sorts, an investment in your future on your terms. Matthew's wariness didn't fade, but curiosity edged into his expression. What kind of investment? I understand you've always wanted your own garage, not just working for someone else, but building something that could be passed down to Nathan someday. The statement was accurate enough to startle Matthew. I'm prepared to provide initial capital for such an enterprise, as a silent partner only. No interference, no corporate structure, no Sullivan name on the building, just financial backing to get you started with a reasonable repayment plan. Alexandra watched with growing hope as Matthew processed the unexpected offer, searching for hidden angles. Why would you do this? Matthew asked directly. After everything you've done to test me, to prove I don't belong in your world, why help me build something in mine? Sullivan answered with uncharacteristic honesty. Because you saved my daughter's life. Because you saved my life. Because in the time I have left, I want to know Alexandra has people around her who value character over convenience, integrity over influence. People like you, Hayes. The sincerity in Sullivan's voice was impossible to dismiss. Still, Matthew hesitated. It would be a business arrangement, Sullivan emphasized, sensing Matthew's reservation. Not charity, not a payoff. An investment in a man who's proven his worth. And perhaps, he glanced at Alexandra, an investment in my daughter's happiness as well. Matthew looked to Alexandra, finding in her expression the same question that had defined their relationship. Could they bridge the gap between their worlds? I'd need to see the terms in writing. Matthew's decision crystallized as he spoke, and I'd insist on repaying every penny with interest. This would be my business built on my terms. Sullivan nodded, satisfaction evident in his posture. I would expect nothing less. Alexandra's smile was radiant as she looked between the two men, the father who had built an empire through ruthless determination and the man who had saved them both through stubborn integrity. One more condition, Matthew added, his voice steady now that his path was clear. I want Nathan involved from the beginning. Learning the business, understanding what it means to build something with your own hands. That's the real legacy I want to leave him. Sullivan extended his hand, the gesture both a business agreement and something more personal, a recognition between men who had tested each other to their limits and emerged with reluctant respect. Then we have a deal, Hayes, or should I start calling you Matthew now? Matthew accepted the handshake, his grip firm despite the bandages. Matthew's fine, but don't think this means I'm calling you Dad anytime soon. Sullivan's startled laugh filled the small apartment, genuine and unguarded. Alexandra joined in the tension of months dissolving in the shared moment of unexpected humor. As Sullivan prepared to leave, he paused at the door, his expression growing serious once more. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment. Not enough time to fix everything I've broken or build everything I've dreamed, but perhaps enough to see the beginnings of something worthwhile. Alexandra moved to her father's side, taking his hand in a gesture of support and reconciliation. Matthew watched them, understanding for the first time the complexity of their relationship. Life doesn't give us the time we think we deserve, Sullivan said quietly. Only the time we have. The measure of a man isn't how much he accumulates, but what he builds that outlasts him. I'm beginning to think you understood that long before I did, Hayes. With a final nod, Sullivan departed. Alexandra returned to Matthew's side, careful of his injuries as she settled beside him. So, her voice held wonder and cautious joy. My father actually approves of you. The world must be ending. Matthew smiled, the pain of his injuries insignificant compared to the lightness in his chest. Not ending, just changing. For all of us. Alexandra rested her head against his uninjured shoulder. When I was trapped in that car, I never imagined the man who pulled me out would end up changing my life. Changing my father. Changing everything. Matthew brushed a kiss against her hair. Sometimes the greatest journeys start with a single moment of doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. Outside the window, Chicago continued its eternal rhythm. Somewhere across town, Nathan was waiting, ready to begin a new chapter. And here in this temporary space, Matthew and Alexandra sat quietly together, no longer separated by wealth or status, but united by something far more valuable, the recognition in each other of someone who saw beyond surfaces to the truth beneath.